and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Happy Tuesday. Let's see if we got that right. Yes, happy Tuesday. I hope that everything is going well on your end. We are just now opening up the session so that people can start to join. We know that it takes people a few moments to join into these sessions. So we're going to go ahead and get it started and opened up now as we do our very, very brief welcome to this session, which is, of course, the session called Standards versus Hackers and Lawmakers, presented by ISACA South Florida in collaboration with Digital Edge and their business partners. So you are in the right place. This is going to be a 3-day training session from 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. Eastern time, today, tomorrow, and the next day. So Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And this is, of course, our first session. We're glad that you're here and you made it to the right place. So we'll go ahead now and do some very brief introductions so that you have some information about who is going to be involved in this session. Right now, as you can see on the left-hand side, there's our agenda, and then on the right-hand side are the people that I'm going to introduce. So first of all, my name is Rob Valdez, and I'm currently serving as president of ISACA South Florida. It's my pleasure to be with you here today and to have this opportunity to share this session with you. I would like to also present Ryan Barris, the Director of Programming for ISACA South Florida, and we're very grateful to Ryan for all the work that he does to make these types of events happen as our Director of Programming. Of course, there is an entire committee involved in programming and planning, and so we're thankful to all the members of the committee for all their work in making this sort of thing happen. And since this is a Zoom session, we encourage participants to use the native desktop client if they're capable of downloading that in their local host. Otherwise, you can use Chrome for the web application to participate in this Zoom webinar. There will be the opportunity for some question and answer, as well as the opportunity to participate in some polling questions if your local host will provide you that sort of functionality. You can always write in your questions in the Q&A module. You can use the chat. We'll be happy to try and monitor those things as the session is progressing. So now let's hop over real quick to our agenda. As you can see right now, we're doing the introductions, and we'll be extremely brief so as to not take any more of the valuable time of our presenters, who are going to be Michael Petrov, the CEO of Digital Edge, and then Keith Barry, the VP of Compliance at Digital Edge. And then in just a little while, we'll also hear from Chester Wisniewski, the Principal Research Scientist at Sophos. So at this time, what I'm going to do, since you now see that it's going to be the next 2 hours, is I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen so that Michael and the Digital Edge team can go ahead and take it away at their leisure. Thank you so much, Michael and Diana, for hosting us today, and please go ahead and take it away.
Hello, everybody. Yana, can you share your screen?
One moment.
So the next slide. So we created this course, and we're modifying this course during this last year. We started with different chapters of ISACA. Our first presentation was done for New York chapter. And after running for 6 months, 10 months, we started getting comments that things, whatever we deliver, is kind of already known to people, because like everybody's learning stuff, and whatever hot subject was yesterday, today is getting colder. So we constantly modifying things not to put people asleep. And basically, the theme of the original presentation was that if you fully implement any standard, any cybersecurity standard, any framework, you should be good if you are under an attack. And we have some analysis of recent breaches or even historical hacks and analysis if implementation of a standard would help to mitigate. And we have it in the form of kind of imaginary bouts. And also we suggest that if there is a possible investigation, possible prosecution for loss of privacy or health information, if you implement fully any of the well-known standards, you should be okay. And the key is basically to take a standard and implement it. And people are getting more and more familiar with different standards. So we are tweaking it a little bit. So we are going to be presenting our vision on the risk tomorrow. And so today, Keith will be talking about current legal system and what's going on in the legal landscape and cybersecurity. And tomorrow I'm going to be speaking about risk, and after tomorrow we're going to be speaking about certain implementation of frameworks in public clouds and practical samples. We can certainly a little bit about the housekeeping. Everything, whatever we present, will be available for you later on through a chapter. You will be able to hook up with us through LinkedIn, ask questions. We love interactivity, so interrupt us. We had, I want to tell you something in the beginning, because we had a comment that when we are saying, oh, we think, we suggest, some people saying, oh, the teacher or the professor is not sure about it. We are not in a high school and even in college. We all, network of professionals, and certain things are subject of my certain experience, and in certain subjects you are more professional and more experienced than me, and it's an opportunity to share our thoughts and our experiences. So I'm not going to be saying that, oh, definitely do this or use this, because everything is subject of experience and application of the skills. So we invite open conversation, and we are not going to be saying that we are not teaching 2 + 2. So we like questions. We like when people challenging us. So we're not going to be like 100% definitive in certain cases. Yana, please switch the case. Okay. So Digital Edge is it's me on our balcony of Panama office. Just love this picture. A little bit of company promotion. Move on. We have offices in New York, Texas, Panama, India, Ukraine, Armenia, just to cover kind of like 24/7 security operations center. We are not staffed equally everywhere, but we have different skills in different regions. Move on. A few things why I think I have rights to speak, and I wouldn't write it. It's only I'll tell you that when I was much younger and in the previous century, I was writing viruses myself, and then I kind of stopped doing this because there are better ways to make money without breaking laws. And it was back in Soviet Union, a country that doesn't exist anymore. So yeah, it was in the past, but I kind of have skills to read the code. I know I used to use assembler language, and I kind of know stuff. Also, we employed multiple convicted hackers from authorities that basically getting on parole, and we had a deal that we would take them and kind of put them back in like normal life after they spend some times behind bars. And another thing, we also participated in a few investigations done by Department of Homeland Security, and kind of have practical experience of kind of working with investigators and investigate cases. Some of them are very weird but practical, so we could share that experience. And I don't want to take any more time and pass this mic to next presenter. Is Keith online? Yana, is Keith online?
Checking it.
Yeah, guys, Keith had a problem with the microphone, so he's promoted now.
Hello, sorry about that. It looks like I wasn't on as a panelist. Apologies. Yana, can you go ahead and share that screen? Okay, hi everybody. My name is Keith Barry. I'm an attorney. I joined Digital Edge back in 2013. I have a background in computer science. So I did my undergrad in. I got a couple certifications, AW Cloud Architect. I've been assisting Digital Edge, just helping companies adhere to laws, regulations, industry standards. Even that's my day-to-day job. This particular module that we do is meant for, technical people on the tech side to just understand at least a basic groundwork of where the laws are, what laws you should be concerned of, what kind of laws there are, and the basic challenges that are in the industry as far as, understanding these laws and, complying with these laws. So I just want to give you just a very sort of basic understanding here when it comes to jurisdictions, because jurisdictions can actually be very problematic when it comes to cybersecurity and privacy. The federal government, is one, is the sort of overarching government that we have here, but all the states are also have their own jurisdictions, and so I just want to go in and just give you an idea of how that works, how the federal government and the states sort of work with each other. The federal government technically isn't above the state governments. They sort of exist side by side, but federal laws have supremacy over state laws as long as the federal government has constitutional right to make the law. All right, so the states can make almost any law they really want theoretically, and the federal government can make very few laws theoretically. In reality, the federal government actually has a lot of authority to make laws under the Commerce Clause and other clauses within the Constitution. And once the federal government makes a law, let's say the federal government was to make a privacy law in the United States, or at least a cybersecurity sort of guideline law that's generally applicable to companies within the United States, that would take precedence over state laws, probably. There's caveats to all that, but generally speaking, what you need to know is that the federal government does have the authority to make a privacy or cybersecurity laws if they want to, and the states do as well. Can you go to the next slide? Okay, so federal laws, regulations may apply to all companies operating within the boundaries of the United States, and they are the main body of regulatory cybersecurity law within the United States, right? And how does the federal government do this? They do this through their agencies. They do this through the SEC. They do this through the FTC, Department of Health and Human Services. That's how these things get done. Congress makes a law. Then they give it over to the agencies. The agencies sort of break it down and they make regulations in order to follow out the law that Congress has enacted. State laws, they may apply to companies operating within the bounds of a particular state. They are still a minority of the laws, the cybersecurity regulatory laws, as far as prosecution goes. Anyway, they are a majority law regarding personal suits against companies who've had security breaches, though. So if you're going to sue, you're probably going to sue under state law, something like negligence or the like. State laws also, every single state, you should know, has a breach notification law, including Florida. Florida chose not to enact an overarching, overall sort of detailed privacy law. Was, I think, back in April or May. It just didn't, it got defeated. So right now, Florida just really has the breach notification law that has to do with private data, which we'll talk about a little later. The U.S. doesn't have a GDPR-like all-encompassing law, right? So we know that the European Union has a GDPR. A lot of us know that. The GDPR is certainly the gold standard on the entire planet regarding privacy. We have laws and regulations that are industry specific. None of them, at least when it comes to privacy, are as far-reaching as the GDPR. And again, they would depend on what industry you're on. Now, that's for the federal government. There are state laws that have now come into effect over this past several years that do have comprehensive privacy laws, usually with some cybersecurity mandates thrown in as well, like California and Virginia, now Colorado. But here's the thing, right? Even though the United States federal government doesn't have this, this comprehensive law that tells companies what to do to have reasonable cybersecurity standards, or what they need to do with regards to people's privacy, or even creating a general right to privacy in the internet. We'd have none of that. What we do have is Federal Trade Commission, which has the authority to prosecute any business in any industry for insufficient cybersecurity controls. The only thing we know for sure, 100%, the rule is that you have to have reasonable cybersecurity controls in place. Once we know that, you would have to go to their, what we call case law in the United States, which is looking at the cases that have been reviewed by the Federal Trade Commission, and seeing what their holdings were and what they require. And if you do look at these cases, you see that they are, quite stringent in what they require. The full boat is required as far as security controls go. You need to have organizational practices and technical practices, procedural practices, controls in place to sufficiently protect people's data and the company's data. And we're going to get into that in a little bit. Can you go to the next one, Yana? Okay, so laws in the United States and really all over the world come in three different flavors when we're talking about cybersecurity privacy. There are laws that mandate security controls, there are laws that mandate breach notifications, and then there are laws that create privacy rights for individuals. Security controls are exactly what you would think. They're technical procedural mandates that companies must have in place. These are firewalls, antivirus, IDS, IPS, incident response plans, awareness training, right? These are very straightforward things that we're familiar with that we sort of have to do every day. Breach notifications are just that. These are mandates, that once there's a breach, there's private information that's been taken or sensitive information or possibly personally identifiable information that's been taken. Depending on the law, you have to report these and who you report it to and the time frame in which you report it to. Well, that's all within each particular law. Generally speaking, you're looking at like a 72-hour window to report. And then, of course, usually there's exceptions as to when you don't have to report in certain cases, and you really have to look at the statutes to see what all that is. Privacy rights, this is a thing in the United States that we don't really have much of. The states themselves, California, Virginia, Colorado, have created privacy rights, GDPR-like statutes. They're not the GDPR. They're not as far-reaching as the GDPR in the United States, but they do provide individuals with some rights on data collection, sharing of their personal data. Who enforces cybersecurity laws in the United States? The federal government, you have the FTC, the SEC, and DHHS do the most of it. You're dealing with FTC is sort of general. They could sort of prosecute anyone. The SEC has to do with financial industry companies. Sometimes, if they're within jurisdiction, it depends. It comes down to the Securities Exchange Act, the various Securities Exchange Acts that have come through over the years, the versions of them. DHHS would have to do with HIPAA mostly, though there are other things that can be prosecuted under FTC, even if there is, even if you are in the healthcare industry. States attorneys general are the most common enforcers of states' laws regarding cybersecurity and privacy. What are the penalties? Well, anything really. Some are large fines. That's the most common. Injunctive orders, which means that you're forced by the court to fix what you got, to increase your controls or just make your controls better or change configurations, as it may be. There's also criminal penalties depending, if you're dealing with certain SEC or certain financial industry laws, there could be criminal penalties involved that could be actually pretty severe. You're talking 10 or 20 years, depending on if it was intentional and depending on what it was that, what information you're withholding from the public or from stockholders. All right, next one. Okay, so let's talk about security controls. So when we're talking about security controls in these statutes that mandate security controls, they're talking administrative, technical, physical security controls to have to be in place. But what's reasonable generally has to do with it has to do with the size of the company that you're in, the type of data that you're dealing with, right? You have to take these into account and kind of find all the foreseeable risks that are reasonably foreseeable. But as a practical matter, these risks are really any possible risk you could possibly think of, and probably a lot of risks that you haven't even thought of. Okay. Bigger companies have to have stronger controls, right? Smaller companies theoretically have to have not as strong controls in place. PII and sensitive data are riskier and need stronger controls to protect them. So these are the basic ideas of what you got to keep in mind when you're trying to determine, what you should be doing as far as controls that you're using for cybersecurity and privacy. Again, it's not all that much help. You guys will have access to this module, but it's sort of vague in the United States, depending on what statute you're looking at. Most statutes don't tell you a lot more than what I'm telling you right here, which is just, oh, you have to have reasonable security controls in place. And they sort of leave it at that. Other statutes will actually list out specific controls that you need, and they'll say, well, you need antivirus, you need IDS, IPS, you have to have firewalls, and there's got to be segregation, all these sorts of things, and they'll actually list it out. But I'm pretty sure every single statute I've ever seen, it does actually list things out. There's a last requirement, which is, and any other control that you should have, that's that's a best practice or that's standard in the industry. So they sort of cover themselves with that. So it turns out to be, even if you think it is kind of helpful, it's not quite as helpful. What you have to do if you're looking at what is truly required is you'd have to look at the cases that have come down in the FTC or the SEC and actually figure out exactly what they're looking for. And I'm going to be honest with you, even if you do all that, and even if you implement all these controls, if there's a breach, they're probably still going to find something that you didn't do right? So what you're doing here is not so much saying, okay, well, we're safe 100%. You're never really going to be safe 100% from the FTC or SEC. But what you want to do is you want to mitigate the losses as much as possible. The worse shape you're in from a security standpoint, the worse they're going to come down on you. All right, and that's sort of the idea. And then, of course, the stronger you are, the less likely you're actually going to have a breach and come up on their radar to begin with. Okay, so your idea of reasonable, right? So again, this is not your idea of reasonable, okay? Just to kind of hammer this point home. This is the court's idea of reasonable, which is super reasonable, which is the most reasonable, the most cautious man who ever walked the face of the planet. It's their idea of what's reasonable, right? So you need to err on the side of caution, is what I'm saying. Penalties can be in the billions of dollars. Agencies usually have a set amount. They can choose or go by violations per instance, not the actual damages caused. So just be aware of that. Like, you may have caused $5 in damages, but they can still come after you for $5 billion. So just be aware of that. Okay, so here are the security control statutes that are common when we're thinking of them. We have FTC, Graham Leach, Bliley, Sarbanes-Oxley, HIPAA, right? You've heard of a lot of these, FINRA. We have, I threw in a couple state laws here, New York State and California. We've probably heard of things like that. Common law causes of action. Now these, again, if you don't have security controls in place, you could come under the common law if you've caused damages to people. If there is damages, real damages, or there's been some sort of harm caused, you could be sued on negligence theory, breach of contract, breach of implied warranty. There's a lot of different causes of actions they can go after you with. I would love to get more into this. I don't have the time because this is only, I only have about 45 minutes to talk. But just going into that is a very tricky part of the law, because it really depends on which state you're in and what theory you're looking to sue under. Generally speaking, it's not very easy for an individual, believe it or not, to win a negligence case based on a negligence claim for private information. that has been somehow hacked or what have you, leaked somehow, it's actually not very easy for a private person to sue and win. So your main fear should be the government agencies. Next one, Ayana. Okay, so every single state in the union plus District of Columbia has a breach notification law, including Florida. They're all similar, as I said. They've got different details. Who do you tell? Who do you have to report to? Do you have to notify the press? Do you have to notify the Attorney General? What if you determine that there's not reasonably likely to cause any harm to anybody? What do you have to do in that case? You probably have to write it down. You have to have a big meeting. It has to be documented. Depending on the state you're in, some states don't allow that. Some states you just have to report it. The GDPR, if you're involved with Europe, is very stringent on breach reporting. They do not play around with that. The hardest thing for Americans is probably jurisdiction with these breach notification laws, right? So you have 50 different states, you have the District of Columbia, and you have to find out, well, who am I notifying in a breach? We've dealt with this at Digital Edge, and it's not an easy thing to necessarily figure out. It's very fact dependent. It's dependent on your business, right? Is there minimum contacts between your business and in Florida and say Arkansas, right? So do you have to actually follow the Arkansas rules of whether or not to inform people? This is a crucial business decision. You got to get your top management involved in this, and you also should consult really with an attorney on who would have jurisdiction. You'd be surprised. It doesn't take much to have jurisdiction in some cases, and yet it does take a lot in other cases. As far as you're going to have general jurisdiction in a particular state, or you're just going to have jurisdiction over that one incident, it really doesn't matter. It may or may not matter for you, but this is a tricky question. And what about overseas? What about other countries? What about their breach notification laws? Other countries, they all have breach notification laws too. So you really have to figure it out. You got to find what states you have customer information, what states are you holding out to, or what states could be thought to be in a position where you have minimum contacts with them that they can actually haul you into court in that state or exercise jurisdiction over you. It's not easy. So applicable statutes here, you have the FTC, Section 5A. HIPAA has breach notification, DFARS, New York State DFS has breach notifications as well. A lot of companies come under there if they're doing business in New York. And then, of course, the state laws. All right, Jan, next one. Okay, so privacy laws. Privacy laws are the most intricate. The gold standard is EU. I already said that. The best one in the United States, or at least the strongest one, depending on what you think is best, is the California, the CCPA or Cal CPA. We see in these sorts of privacy laws, this sort of idea of segregating companies into either data controllers or data processors. Controller, controls the data. They may or may not take in the data, but they definitely control the data and purpose and means of processing it. Data controllers are just sort of, they sort of just process on behalf of the data controller and just sort of take the directions from the data controller. Data controllers are responsible for ensuring that the processors provide sufficient guarantees to implement appropriate technical and organizational measures, and under whatever you're talking about on GDPR or Cal CPA. What they're trying to do here is they kind of want to say that, well, controllers are really sort of responsible, and they should be making sure that their data is being handled properly, and that if notifications need to be made, they're in on it. They're being told by their processors, what happened, and then they're making the decision, and that they're mandating their processors to do the right thing. Let's see here. Usually these laws consist of security breach notification requirements, right? So usually when you have a privacy law, they usually just bundle it in and they include within that privacy law, breach notification law, and also some sort of lip service to having reasonable cybersecurity controls, given the size and complexity of the business and the sensitivity of the data. What you should know about privacy laws too, that a lot of people I find get sort of confused about, is that PII does not mean sensitive information. It means personally identifiable information, right? It doesn't necessarily even mean really private in that sense. Now, the lingo is all over the place in the industry currently, and it's probably going to stay that way for a while. Different laws use different words, different terms of art that define what is private information or sensitive information or PII or non-public information. You have all these different terms of arts being thrown around, and they all have different definitions depending on the state and jurisdiction you're in. Or if in the federal government, depending on what statute you're talking about, they'll have different definitions of what that is, of what they're using, the names that they're using, different terms of arts. And then even if it's the same term that they're using, they'll define it a little differently. So it's a little bit all over the place, but best way to think of it, and really the definitive way, is the way that GDPR does. And that's the way that I always talk about it, which is that you have PII, and that's really, when you're talking about the GDPR, all right, and we're talking about being the most protective over personal information. You're really talking about PII, which does not mean sensitive information, just any information that can identify a particular person. All right. So it does include email addresses. It does include phone numbers. These are not particularly sensitive bits of information here, but it still is PII. Right. And then if you look at these statutes, what they'll have, let's say the GDPR or Cal CPA, though they use different terms, they don't use the same terms as each other. You have a special category for sensitive PII, so you have sensitive PII. Well, that should get even more protection, like somebody's race or gender, anything like that, ideological, anything, that could be considered sensitive. So you should know that there is a distinction. And so some statutes will protect sensitive PII, sensitive information. Other statutes will protect all PII. So just keep an eye out for that. Next one, Yana. Okay, so typical PII specific security requirements are in these laws, right? Okay, so typically what you're going to see is they're going to want you to pseudonymize, there we go, the data, which is to say, just don't use the person's real name, use some other pseudonym that you can, that you, but nobody else, are able to map to a particular person. If that's even necessary. Ideally, you would just give them a pseudonym and then just forget who it was. But generally speaking, that's not what companies are looking to do. But that's so yeah, you give them a pseudonym and then you have somewhere else where there's a mapping to who these people are. So you have in one case the sensitive data, and then in the other case it's really just the name, so you're sort of segregating them out, so it's more secure. Encryption of PII at rest is pretty much mandatory, and it's so standard now in the industry. It's not, I find with my clients now, encryption of everything at rest is pretty much the standard. Everybody's in the cloud, and the cloud is encrypted at rest. And you have Apple laptops, and it's so easy. And then with even Windows laptops, to just enable BitLocker, it's really a no-brainer. So we live in a very encrypted, at least a lot of companies now are very much encrypted at rest. PII must be collected for legitimate purposes. You're going to see that. They don't want you They don't want you doing things like just taking people's information and that and giving it away to places that you shouldn't be giving it to. They also want you to tell people why you're taking their information, the classes of information that they'll be taking, that sort of thing. Data minimization. This is something that companies have a harder time doing. Um, this requires some work, some setup, um, and the, um, the rule is here that you should just take out whatever you don't need. And by don't need, if there's a business reason, if there's no business reason for having it, you should get rid of it. And as long as, there's not some retention policy that's making you keep it, right? So anything that's exceeded a retention policy, you should look and see if there's a business need to actually keep that data. And as I said before, special care must be taken to protect sensitive PII. And that's it. Pretty much there. They just often put some cybersecurity technical controls possibly in place. They'll say, oh, well, you need controls in place. You have to be reasonable to protect PII. So that's pretty standard. The thing that's that gives that people are most interested in or the users from their point of view are the bundle of rights that they're given. They're given a right to consent before PII is collected. They may have a right to access. Well, they almost always have a right to access their information in these laws. Right to be forgotten. Not so often. This is a GDPR thing for the most part. Minors in California have a similar right, but in GDPR, everybody has that right. Right to be informed of the PII that's taken, what categories it's taken, right to be informed of what entities your PII will be shared with. Well, that's a big one. And that's one of the ones that you'll find even in the United States laws, the states, you'll see that where you're supposed to be told what categories are taken and you're told who it's being shared with, right? And then you have this right to correct inaccurate information, which a lot of people like, well, okay, why is that, such an important right? Well, it has to do with, let's say, well, I'll just give an example. Let's say somebody has, let's say TransUnion, has inaccurate information, right, about you, and so your credit score is low, or TransUnion is relying on another company that has inaccurate information, and that's lowering your credit score, right? So you should be able to go to that other company that they're relying on and correct that information, right? So that's where that comes from, and then a right to withdraw consent or to collect or process PII, and that's usually not an absolute right. Usually there's some, there's got to be some reason. You can usually use a reason possibly overcome the right to withdraw consent, depending on what law we're talking about. Next slide. And here are the applicable statutes. As you can see, it's very California heavy. I didn't put in here, there's also Virginia, Colorado now. But these are the ones that you have to watch out for with privacy laws for the federal government, the main ones. Next slide. And then here I just have a, for your use, it's just a grid here, just telling you what the very common laws are. And again, there are a ton of laws. The set is much bigger than what I'm showing you here. But you should be familiar with all the laws that are in your industry or that your company comes under. So as you can see, the penalties are on the right-hand side. They could get very large per violation. What does per violation mean? Well, that's really up to the court, isn't it? Right? That's up to the person who decides what the law means, which is to say the judge, the administrative judge. And what they've always found is that it means the worst possible thing, which is that it doesn't mean that, oh, well, we had a violation and that, we didn't do this patch. so 500,000 people got exposed, right? Then I can say, oh, well, the violation isn't just that you didn't patch, you didn't do the patch. That's not just one violation. It's actually $43,280 times 500,000 people. That's what that means. Okay, so just be aware of that. It's always going to mean the worst possible thing, and that's just how it's done. It just tells you here too, some of these laws, they have security controls, breach notification, and privacy rights, or they just have one or just the other. It just sort of tells you where those are. Now, as far as privacy rights goes, this is something everybody should know, even if you don't come under, or you don't think you come under any privacy laws, is that you're not allowed to make any promises of any sort of privacy unless you're actually doing it. Facebook learned this the hard way, right? So Facebook didn't come under any of those laws, right? Not in the United States anyway, but they were saying to people that, oh, we're going to keep your data confidential. And that turned out to be a lie. And the FTC fined them $5 billion for that. So does the FTC Act have privacy rights? Yes and no. The core of the FTC Act is against false advertising, essentially, right? Corrupt advertising practices or corrupt business practices. So if you're saying you do one thing and you're actually doing something else, that's actually within the core of the FTC Act of Section 5A, and they will come down on you quite heavily for that, because that's even worse than just, a negligent sort of omission or something like that. There's sort of intent there, which is makes things worse. I think that's it. Yana, what's the next slide? Okay, there we go. So that's it for me. I don't know if we want to take questions or.
Sure, we can run the poll questions. Rob, can you start them, please?
Yes, I will go ahead and launch the first polling question now. And the first polling question has to do with privacy protections by state. The question is, which state has the most privacy protections in place? And the potential responses include New York, Virginia, California, and Nevada. And we have about 50 responses so far. 60, getting up to about 70% participation on the poll. Now up to almost 80% participation. We'll let just another moment pass as we give a few people some additional chances to respond. And I think maybe that's enough time. So I'll go ahead and end the polling and share the results. So as we can see, 90% of the responders said that California has the most privacy protections in place, and 10% said New York.
Okay, well, the answer is California. Congratulations to those 90%. California has a ton of privacy stuff in place. California's been doing it for a while too. They have 5 different statutes pertaining to privacy, depending if we're talking about minors or if we're the shine the light law. There's all sorts of things California has going for it. And then of course the Cal CPA, which is sort of generally applicable, and that's all great and good, and that's fine. But you see what they do in the United States, and even California does this, is that it's actually not like the Cal CPA is actually, we say it's got a lot of protections and does all these things. Yes, that's true, as long as you come under the jurisdiction of the statute. But in order to come under the jurisdiction of the statute, you have to have the personal information of 100,000, well, right now 50,000 citizens, but soon to be 100,000 citizens, right? So it really depends on what industry you're in and the size of your company, right? So a lot of companies are not even subject to the California law because they just don't have that much privacy. So yes, is it good that they're doing that? Yes. Is it really as strong as like the GDPR or anything like that? No. But yes, you're correct here. California by far. New York actually doesn't have much as far as privacy protection goes. We have the Shield law, but that is absolutely nothing close to what California has. So I guess we could do the next one.
Sure. Let's go ahead and proceed to the next polling question. And I'm launching that now. The question relates to the Cal CPA. If the federal government passes a comprehensive cybersecurity and privacy law, will the Cal CPA be invalidated? And the potential responses are yes, no, and possibly, right? The proverbial "it depends" response. So let's see, we have about 50% participation already, passing 60% participation. Now we're getting up to 70% participation, and we'll go ahead and allow just another minute or so as people are thinking about what will be the impact if and when the federal government passes comprehensive cybersecurity and privacy law. So this has been open for about a minute now. I'll go ahead and close the poll and share the results. And we can see from the results that we have, just by a very thin margin, 45% of the respondents said possibly, 44% of the respondents said no, it will not be invalidated, and 11% of the respondents said yes, it will be invalidated. So what do we think here?
Well, you know what? It's actually possibly, and that's it's very good. Very good. I'm glad to see that there's 45%. Yeah, no, that's in the law. That's often the case. It's possible. So, okay, so if the federal government was to do a comprehensive law for cybersecurity privacy, they would do so under the Commerce Clause of the Constitution, and of course, they would have supremacy. But here's the thing. How much supremacy? Would they have full field preemption, which is to say they would, the intent of Congress was to completely control cybersecurity and privacy within the United States? Or is it that they were just putting this out there, but the states are free to supplement that law? Okay. And that is just dependent on the law that they ultimately decide to pass, and what the intent of what the court finds the intent of Congress to be. Oftentimes in the statute, and here they would probably put in what their intent is. So it would depend. My gut feeling is if they were to do this, they would probably leave the states free to supplement. So I would say that if anything, the correct answer is possibly. But the second correct answer would be no. So we did good here. I could definitely see how people would say yes. I mean, look, you think, okay, well, the federal government, what they say, that's going to overrule everything, but not necessarily. It's all very fact dependent. So yeah, very good. I like to see that.
Excellent. Shall we do the third polling question?
Sure.
All right, let's go ahead and share that now. This one relates to agency fines. So this question is, what agency is most likely to fine a company that is not in the financial sector over insufficient cybersecurity controls? And the potential answers include the SEC, DHHS, state attorneys general, and the FTC. So 4 responses to choose from there. And people are thinking about this one a little bit. Let's see, we've got about 33% participation on the responses so far in the first minute or so of this being open. And now we're up to about almost 60%. Sounds like some people are starting to narrow down their options and pick a choice. And maybe they close their eyes and then point at the screen perhaps and figure out the right one. Now we're up to almost 70%. So it looks like we got some good participation on this question, along with some diverse answers. Let's see if we'll go ahead and close this and share the results. So this one has a little bit of diversity in the responses. 44% of people said the FTC, 22% of people said the SEC, 19% said DHHS, and then 15% said state attorneys general.
Right. Okay. Well, again, you have a smart audience, and this is not an easy question. So the answer is the FTC. That's correct, right? Because the FTC has the general power or has authority over every business, right? Whereas SEC, DHHS, state attorneys general, right? It's more limited, right? The state attorney general can only do it for that particular state. DHHS is just going to be cases that involve HIPAA, and the SEC is just going to be for cases that are for companies that are within the financial industry. And even then, not every company within the financial industry, just certain ones that come under the Securities and Exchange Act of 1945, right? Well, depending on what statute we're talking about. So yeah, the correct answer is the FTC. State attorneys general too. I mean, just as an aside, you know, there's not a lot of action on the states as far as enforcement, you know, that I've seen. You know, the big enforcers, FTC, SEC, is also enforcing more and more and more and more and more on cybersecurity. So if you're in the financial industry, you better tighten that up, because the SEC is for the last few years now has been, you know, this has been one of their top priorities. So again, thank you guys. That's really cool.
Excellent. So here I'll go ahead and stop sharing the results, and then make sure to remind people that the chat functionality is open, as well as the Q&A module within this session, just in case we had any final questions for this first part of the presentation before we wrapped up. So we'll allow just a moment to see if anybody had any questions that they wanted to submit, or otherwise comments for prompt for response or other commentary. And I don't see any at this moment. So were there any final thoughts that we wanted to share before concluding the first part of the session?
You know, that's it for me now. I'm just, I hope you guys, you know, we're able to take something away from this. The module will be available to you. It's probably written more clearly than I spoke, and I do apologize. Plus, my New York accent, I'm sure, wasn't entirely helpful. But, you know, yeah, again, this is for, you know, technical people, just to get an idea of what they're looking at. It's a little bit more basic. Again, I didn't have time to go into any more real depth. But if you have any questions or anything like that, that, you know, comes up, you think about, just, you know, you can contact me. I'm Digital Edge. You just send me an email and I'll get right back to you. All right.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. And we certainly do appreciate it. And I dare say, you know, down here in South Florida, we should be pretty comfortable with New York accents, because there seems to be a pretty strong pipeline between here and New York. So thanks very much for that presentation. And there's another comment that comes in as well saying, excellent overview, useful from London. So it's good to compare to the GDPR as well, for kind of an international perspective. So,
Right.
so thanks very
guys.
much.
Thank you.
And now, Yana and team, I think we're going to move on to Chester Wisniewski, who's the principal research scientist at Sophos. So I'll go ahead and step aside in case Yana or Chester wanted to go ahead and get started with the next part of this session.
Great. Thanks for having me. I'm not sure if there was somebody was going to introduce me or not, but if considering not hearing anyone, I'm going to assume that I'm to proceed. So you're now going to get a different accent. It's definitely not New York, but I'm coming to you from Vancouver, Canada. So we're kind of making the rounds of North America here today. And I appreciate the opportunity to present to you guys today. Looks like a pretty good number of you are able to join us. And I'm going to talk about threats. So I am not a lawyer, and I'm mostly not going to talk about the law in this particular presentation. I think that's been covered pretty well. I am just going to find my slides so I can pull them up one moment. I've got too many things open on my computer here, so. But briefly, I work at Sophos, and I've worked at Sophos. Well, next week I'll be 18 years at Sophos. I work in research, and so one of the really cool things about my job is I get to work with all of our other researchers and sort of collect together the collective intelligence of all the work we do around the world. And then I get to share that with all of you. When there's not a pandemic, I'm typically at conferences all year round, presenting at Black Hat and DEF CON and lots of regional events like ISACA and ISC² events around the US and Canada and around the world. And I'm going to ask for confirmation. Hopefully Rob can give me a nod if my slides came up okay. Yep, okay, good. And so briefly, my job is to work with all of our other researchers, right? And for some reason, my own slides keep vanishing, so that's weird. There they go, got them back. At Sophos, we're a pretty big company. So briefly, I'm going to kind of cover the threat landscape and just sort of where we get a lot of our data. And we've got lots of different sources of things now. Some of you may be familiar with us from in the olden days in the 1980s and 90s when we were an antivirus company. But now we do a lot more than that. So it's really actually made my job a heck of a lot more interesting because we can paint a much more detailed picture of what's happening in the threat landscape when we have more than just malicious file samples, which is what, of course, we traditionally would have as like an antivirus company. You get a malicious document or a virus or a worm or a Trojan. Now we get a lot more of the whole picture. And so that's what I'm going to kind of present to you today. My best effort at what does this threat landscape look like right now in September 2021. Who the adversaries are and why and how they're going about it, I think is important for helping inform our defenses. So we're going to cover that for a little bit, cover the probably three biggest concerns and attacks that we're seeing succeed right now. Clearly ransomware, I wish it would go away. I've been talking about nothing but ransomware for 7 or 8 years now. But unfortunately it's lucrative. So we will cover that because I think it's quite important. But we'll also talk about business email compromise, a little bit more about some of how supply chains are starting to get poisoned. That's having an impact. And people often wonder, well, how does this all start within my organization? And it's very different now than it was, say, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. So if you've been around the IT scene for a while, you may have some outdated views of how these things begin. And there's a whole industry called initial access brokers now, which is generally how they're getting that initial foothold within an organization that they later are going to hold hostage with ransomware or do coin mining or whatever thing it is they're going to do. I didn't submit any poll questions because there was a little miscommunication, but I encourage you to use the chat function to let me know if you have some things. I'll stop occasionally and check, and I'm more than happy to go wherever you'd like to go and learn more about the threat landscape in the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. So briefly, we use a lot of different products out there now, and so this is where our data is coming from. And this isn't meant in any way to talk about products, just to give you an idea of we're getting a lot of information from different places now. And so the labs, of course, primarily is worried about those malicious files, but also malicious links, anything that's tangible that we can analyze to turn into some sort of intelligence in the products to defend people. But we also have our security operations group now, which not only includes our internal security team that helps protect Sophos, but it also includes our managed threat response and rapid response teams. And those are customer-facing teams that are helping customers manage their security. You could think of managed threat response similar to maybe a virtual SOC, where we're there monitoring for security events and providing advice and helping customers defend themselves. And rapid response is sort of the oh crap service, which is I just got hit with ransomware. Could you please help me? I need to know what to do. And so between those two things and then adding them into that traditional file intelligence gives us kind of a more complete picture of what are the criminals actually doing when they're interacting with a system? How are they exploiting it? How are they getting that initial foothold? And then what files are they using and what things do those things do that we analyze in the lab? So there's a lot of different sources of data coming in now that allow us to have a pretty complete picture of any given attack. So I'm going to start by talking about the threat actors that we face and sort of how they work. And we're going to spend a different amount of time on these. On the left, of course, is your traditional government paid for hacker, right? Whether they're in the Ministry of State Security in China, or whether they're part of the GRU in Russia, or whether they're working for the NSA. Clearly these organizations exist. Every government pretty much has a cyber unit at this point. But what's interesting about this is, had I presented this to you 5 years ago, I probably wouldn't have included this, because most of us aren't in positions where we're necessarily the targets of nation state level operations, right? Typically, if you're outside of defense, maybe even finance, perhaps critical infrastructure, then you may have always faced these adversaries. But the average company just doesn't normally see activity from nation states. And this is dramatically changing the last few years. And some of that's due to sanctions, some of that's just due to cooling tensions with Russia and other countries. But it's gotten very active to the point where it's actually having an impact on everyday cybersecurity. And I'll go into that just a little bit. Most of the time I'm going to spend talking to you today about this middle group. That's a picture, of course, with a hacker laptop with all the stickers on it. And I call these guys advanced persistent thieves, right? We've got advanced persistent threats, which are government entities, but these people have really refined their skills to the point where they're nearly on par with government level skill sets, but they're instead doing ransom attacks. And that's where the majority of the activity that we see that's financially driven, that's impacting most organizations most frequently, is being driven by these advanced persistent thieves, as I refer to them. So most of the presentation is going to focus on a lot of their activity. And then the last category, of course, we've got these cut and paste folks, right? The folks that literally don't know what they're doing. They're going to the hacker forum and asking questions about how they steal their girlfriend's Facebook account and this kind of stuff. And you might discount them, but unfortunately, the freely available open source nature of so many scripts and tools now, there's even some sophistication amongst people that don't know what they're doing, literally menu-driven malware that's still having impact. For most organizations, hopefully your security bar is high enough that these things aren't real threats, but they may be threats to individual people within your organization and have impacts on them, especially now that we're in so much more of a remote work environment globally. It may not harm the whole company. They may not hold all of your organization ransomed, but if it affects, individual employees' productivity or data, it still has an impact. And these groups are very active. I mean, if you look at something like the ransomware scene, organizations, companies that are being hit with serious ransomware, it's probably somewhere in the vicinity of maybe 100 organizations a day, which is a lot. Don't get me wrong. I mean, it's shocking how prevalent it is. But when we're looking at the script kiddies, the cut and paste kids, they're infecting probably tens of thousands of computers a day. They're not getting very much money out of them. They're not having a heck of a lot of success necessarily extorting them, and they're not getting $1 million from a victim. But it's an annoyance, and it still has an impact on business and productivity, and be better if we didn't have to deal with it. So we'll talk about it a little tiny bit, but not too much. So we'll start with the nation states, because this is where things have just gotten real fast in especially the last 2 years. North Korea, if you read cybersecurity articles, you may often hear them referred to by things related to Cobras. That's often the code name used to name these different hacker groups that are coming out of North Korea. In this particular case, the one I'm most interested in and follow closely is called Hidden Cobra. And they were famous, of course, for having hacked Sony Pictures for trying to release that movie about the dear leader in the interview. And at that time, it was a little surprising to us that we saw a nation state actually attack a private sector entity. It's very unusual to see. You see espionage against private sector entities. China is quite famous for intellectual property theft, but you don't usually see like networks wiped out and hard drives erased by nation states for private companies. It was a bit of a weird wake-up call for many of us in the industry. And what's very interesting now is they're almost 100% into Bitcoin theft, or any kind of cryptocurrency, but primarily Bitcoin. The sanctions have just been terrible on North Korea, and they realized very early on, like, wow, this cryptocurrency stuff is perfect. Not only is it great for buying drugs and hiding, illicit transactions in the black market, it allows us as a nation state to literally hidden move billions of dollars around, and there's nobody to stop us, right? There's no anti-money laundering laws. There's nothing to prevent us from using this to evade the sanctions that most of the world has imposed on North Korea. It's estimated that in 2020, they had stepped it up. They literally stole more than $2 billion worth of cryptocurrency in 2020, which is over 10% of their gross domestic product. So 10% of their entire economy is just stolen cryptocurrency. And we believe that money is likely being used to help fund some of their weapons programs. So this has become a big business. They primarily go after cryptocurrency exchanges, but they have not been afraid to target individuals as well. So they've been behind phishing campaigns, impersonating cryptocurrency exchanges like Binance, trying to get people's passwords to log in and empty their wallets. They've been behind malware that just infects thousands of PCs, checking them to see if they have cryptocurrency wallets, and if they do, stealing them and sending them back to the North Koreans. They've been very active, and they're starting to have impacts on a lot of organizations and individuals that are, as I kind of paraphrase, just not your nation state, your typical nation state targets. Iran started taking a page out of their playbook a while, not too long after North Korea got into it. We've seen a lot more of this activity coming out of Iran now as well. Whether it's being driven to evade sanctions is less clear, because Iran has not made a beeline directly for cryptocurrency the same way that North Korea has, but they did seemingly start turning a blind eye to hackers operating inside of Iran, targeting Western targets, primarily American targets. SamSam was an early large-scale ransomware group. We wrote some papers and worked with the FBI to get them shut down a couple of years. Well, I don't know how you shut them down. It was actually surprising to us. I don't know if it was surprising to the FBI or not, but we did a series of write-ups on them, I think in 2016, 2017, detailing how they worked, and we had not all the information we had we made publicly available. We shared some of that with law enforcement. Eventually that resulted in the people behind SamSam being indicted because of course we can't get extradition from Iran, but the FBI decided to name and shame them. And so they, the wanted poster came out with these two Iranians that were behind these ransom attacks. They had cleared about $6 million over the course of 2.5 years. And all of a sudden the attack stopped. Like, we never saw SamSam again after the wanted poster came out. So it's unclear whether that, resulted in some political responses within Iran to not be, directly attacking American targets, or whether they were just asked to stop, or whether they decided the heat was too high. And geez, $6 million goes a long way for an Iranian. So why keep doing it? Just try to vanish. Not really sure. When we're talking about Iran, we often refer to the animals that represent the hacker groups that often get named after our kittens. In this case, it was Static Kitten. And the good thing about the internet is you can find any kind of kitten, no matter what the name is, if you type it into Google. So I was able to find a kitten, Static Electricity Kitten there. But the Static Kitten group's interesting because they seem to be playing a little bit longer game than North Korea. There were some vulnerabilities in Citrix remote access products at the end of 2019, right before the pandemic started. And then that led to some vulnerabilities in being discovered in Fortinet VPN and Pulse Secure VPN products, all things that were in heavy use, especially in March and April of 2020. And as a result, people were finding scanning and analyzing more carefully network access products, trying to find vulnerabilities to exploit them. And the Iranians jumped all over those Pulse Secure vulnerabilities and were logging into all these VPN concentrators. Pretty much everyone in the world that wasn't patched, the Iranians were in. And it looks like their goal was just to steal credentials. They didn't do anything with the VPN access that they got, but in every case, they were logging into the VPN. Many of those VPNs were connected to the Active Directory services within the victim organization. And they were able to then steal the entire Active Directory sets of usernames and passwords from those victim organizations through these exploits. What they're doing with them, we don't know, but we do know that most people's passwords don't change. So if they've got other access methods, they may be able to now access those networks. And I mean, organizations that force employees to change passwords generally end up with even poorer passwords than companies that don't. We strongly recommend against password rotation, because users will choose shorter, crappier passwords and make them very predictable because they have to change them all the time. Whereas you might memorize a good one and not, if you don't have to change it, you might make it more complex. So they're kind of banking on those credentials remaining valid or being predictable enough that they can iterate the number on the end, which is what people do when they're forced to change them to still gain access to those networks. Can't forget the Russians. There's always some kind of a bear. In particular, Cozy Bear is one of the bigger groups, APT28. They were implicated in the hacking of the U.S. elections in the 2016 elections. The Russians have not veered too far from the traditional nation-state path, although certainly getting involved in social aspects like messing with elections. Certainly, also this group was alleged to have been behind attacking, the attacks were called Black Energy, which were the attacks in Ukraine against the power grid. 2 Christmases in a row, they were able to take out parts of the power grid. There's some interesting stuff around. I have a whole presentation just on that topic. It's kind of fascinating how both elections and power grids in America are incredibly diverse, which is certainly a strength when it comes to security. Because if you wanted to hack an election, you'd have to figure out how to hack like 480 different counties, processes, and software, and like it's just but the problem, of course, is securing something that has 480 different ways of doing is a nightmare, right? The Federal Election Commission's desperately trying to figure out how to better secure our elections, but there's no piece of advice that applies from one county to the next, let alone one state to the next in many cases, because there's such diversity. And the similar thing's true with the energy grid. We personally, I believe the hacking of the Ukraine grid was a kind of a shot across the bow for NATO nations to go, we're in your critical infrastructure, we can do this, and we're going to demonstrate to you that we can do it. But again, Ukraine, Poland, Hungary, countries that were under the Soviet Union had nearly identical control systems for their entire power grid. It was all uniform, which made it mean that if you were able to access one thing, you were likely able to access all the things. And again, in America, the grid is managed and monitored by hundreds of different organizations that all have different software, different hardware, different policies, different procedures, and different levels of security. So taking out any given part of the American grid is totally doable, right? Because it's really hard to secure because it's so varied. There's no easy way to just apply one fix to it. But on the other hand, taking down the actual whole grid or even a chunk of the grid is almost impossible, because what they do in Florida is different than what they do in New York, and certainly not the thing they do in California. And that diversity means it's incredibly difficult to have a wide-scale impact. But the Russians are still to be watched. Mostly they are harboring some ransomware groups, and we're not quite sure why, but it all seems to be to create social confusion, just like the fake accounts on Twitter and Facebook and other things. These ransom groups seem to be there just to muddy the waters. I don't believe they're actively stealing the money for the state the way we see, for example, in North Korea. And lastly, China, which is always referred to by some sort of panda moniker. To me, the most interesting group has been what's known as Bamboo Panda. They're really focusing in on supply chain. And again, the long game, right? China's not, they don't just have a 5-year plan for what the Communist Party is going to do over there, right? They think big and they think long term. And so like Iran, it appears they're doing a lot of positioning within the supply chain so that if there were a war or there were some kind of conflict or they wanted to send a message the way the Russians have sent a few messages, they're in a position at any time to just decide to do it, because within the supply chain, they could trigger an attack, they could turn something on, they could turn something off, they can collect credentials, and they might not be actively using that access to cause a direct harm immediately, but they're certainly well positioned to cause harm at any point that they need to or want to. And we also still do see a lot of intellectual property theft. It had waned for a little while. I believe President Obama had some words with Xi Jinping 6-7 years ago, and things had slowed down a little bit on the IP theft front coming out of China. That seems to have ramped right back up again, especially during some of the tense times in the Trump administration, but even continuing on through the Biden administration. I mean, this isn't political. I mean, it can be political. Clearly, when political situation is bad, there's more likely they're going to do things, but it's really about whether there's any risk to them of getting caught, what can be done to them if they are caught, and what the economic advantages are to stealing. And it doesn't look like we have a way to control that very well other than to secure our crap. So I advise you to secure your crap, especially if you've got intellectual property that would be valuable to be stolen. So that's kind of, my spiel on the nation state stuff. This is all starting to leak into the private sector now, right? China's after intellectual property. The Russians are after just sowing mayhem. The North Koreans will steal any money you have, and they're certainly happy to do ransomware attacks or steal cryptocurrency or anything else they can get their hands on. And the Iranians are positioning themselves to be able to cause some chaos if they choose to. So this is not a good situation for us to now have to worry about that in addition to these guys. And this is where the meat, the bulk of what's going on out there is going on. It's these advanced persistent thieves. And what's very interesting is they've really evolved a pretty mature economy around this. And we've always seen groups of people working together. If you've been doing this for as long as I have, in the early 2000s, there certainly were people competing with one another and sometimes collaborating on writing early worms. If you remember Melissa and Nimda and all those worms from 2000 to 2006, 7, 8, somewhere around there was when they were all really popular. And there were actually groups competing with each other to take over other people's computers that were already taken over by their competitors and to lock the competitors out. We even saw some of the groups would break into something and then patch it so nobody else could break into it, so they would have exclusive access to it. But that slowly started evolving as money entered into it more and more. I mean, just controlling 10,000 computers does you no good if you're not making any money. And then they figured out, hey, we can sell penis pills, and spammers needed fresh, clean IP addresses that weren't going to get blocked by any spam products. So suddenly there was a way to make money by controlling a bunch of computers. And then it turned into DDoS, and then that evolved into some other things. And as that all evolved, the economy that supported it, as the money got bigger, started evolving as well. And I would argue that started with, there was a Russian word, partnerka. And partnerka was what really drove the pharmacy spam, Canadian pharmacy, if you want a Canadian. I used to joke, so most of your Florida, I always used to joke that, they're from St. Petersburg, but not that one, the other one, right? Like clearly they're not Canadian pharmacies, and they're obviously not operating out of North Florida. They're concentrated where they know they're not going to go to jail. But what partnerka did was kind of borrow the idea from Amway of a pyramid scheme of how they would sell these pharmacy products, right? There were kingpins at the top that ran the factories in Chennai, India, that actually made the fake pills. And then they worked with an affiliate network where the people at the top got the most amount of money, and then the people selling the pills got the least amount of money, and it was, and the money flowed up the pyramid. And that kind of started the idea of evolving this legitimate and illegitimate, but a true functioning black market in the cyberspace area rather than just the traditional black markets. And as a result of that, later on, we saw exploit kits. We saw things like black hole exploit kit in the mid-late 2000s start to specialize and go, you know what, I'm not going to write malware. I'm just going to sell people a subscription to exploits to put malware on people's computers. I'm going to figure out how to break into Adobe Flash. I'm going to figure out how to break into Java, and then I'll sell that as a service to somebody who wants me to put malware on people's computers. And so the tasks kept getting split up into smaller and smaller specialized tasks that people could focus on and become really, really good at. We saw the same thing with credit card theft. Credit card thieves would literally have one person would specialize in like laminating cards and re-encoding the magnetic stripes on the back to do a run of 500 Chase Bank cards for an attack. And that was all he did. Just all he knew how to do was run the mag stripe thing. Another different person, oh, that person was the person who was stealing the mag stripe data by compromising the payment processing shopping cart at a website. And then another person would manage the money mules and would literally recruit people to go to ATMs and use the fake cards to take the cash out. And so as they got more and more specialized that way, they got very efficient at making much more money and scaling the ability to steal. When millions of credit cards were stolen at Target, it actually had a real impact on the black market. The price of stolen credit cards plummeted. You could get credit cards for 25 or 30 cents a piece for a while because suddenly 40 million credit cards went into inventory. And just like a real marketplace, that affects the price. And so these guys even got to the cartel level of controlling the feed of stolen cards into the marketplaces to keep the prices inflated while they did their attacks. So now we're at the other extreme end of this with the ransomware, and this black market is feeding this. They're able to hire translators. That's why I got the language books there. When you get a phish from one of these guys, it's not like broken English stuff. It's not Google Translate stuff that you might have even gotten after the broken English stuff. The modern phishes we're seeing are written by native English, Spanish, whatever language they're being received in by speakers from those countries. We even see them specifically doing different Portuguese spam runs for Brazil and Portugal, for example, to get the local nuance of the language, the accent, the slang, the brand names. All of this stuff needs to be accurate in order to lure people in. And many of us are off our guard because we're used to watching for the spelling mistakes and the crude errors they used to make. And that just doesn't work anymore. These guys are hiring professionals to do this work. Sometimes legitimate people that don't even know they're working for criminals. They go into these job for hire sites, in particular in translation. We see like a lot of women on maternity leave will do translation work on the side to make some money while they're out from their main job, and they, you hand them some text that you need translated from a language they speak, and they're happy to do it. They don't even realize they may be working for criminals. Money laundering has become very specialized now. There's different groups that know how to launder different types of cryptocurrency and will offer that as a service to the criminals. So when they get the $6 million ransom payout, it's pretty hard to turn that into cash currency without getting caught. And so there's groups that are specializing just in handling the money laundering aspects. And of course, the people who actually have to write the code that does many of these things. But the weird thing is the coders are the ones that are losing their jobs. Like there's very rarely custom malware involved in many of these attacks anymore. They're using off-the-shelf tools that are designed for penetration testers, that are designed for IT administrators, and just combining them in malicious ways rather than actually writing bespoke malware like we might have seen to steal credit cards. I mean, that's still out there. There's a group called MageCart that's probably the biggest credit card thieving ring. And they do write bespoke malware to skim the credit card data from websites they're able to break into. But these ransomware guys in particular, it's just PowerShell scripts and legitimate tools like Metasploit and Cobalt Strike and things that many companies use to secure themselves. So I talked about this a little bit. I mean, nothing is really new, right? I mean, going back into those early days, it was about pills and clicking the "I want to see the nude Angelina Jolie" video that got people in trouble. And then we got pretty good at blocking spam, like as an industry. Like we really, if you think about the number you get in your mailbox, you probably see 1 or 2 a day, but that's 1 or 2 out of the 100 that were slung at you. So, as we got better, they moved away from that and they shifted to the web. And that the 2008 to 2014 was sort of the years of web exploitation. We all had Flash and Java installed, and they were both horribly insecure plugins in our browsers. And it took us the better part of 5 or 6 years to develop better technology like HTML5 to get all the browsers more secure. And if you look at things around 2013, 2014, that's when you had Chrome that just updated itself every time you launched it, and Firefox updated itself every time you launched it, and Microsoft was still scrambling with Internet Explorer to get it patched every Patch Tuesday. But everybody moved away from Internet Explorer because it was such a security mess. And so the web got really secure. It's hard to attack a web browser that doesn't have a plugin. And those 0 days in web browsers are worth millions of dollars to governments that want to spy on people. And at that time, at least, the criminals didn't have the money to compete with governments. They do now, right? When you're pulling in millions of dollars in ransom, you can just pay somebody for the same level of attack kit that a government would pay because you've got millions of dollars laying around. But that wasn't the case in 2010, 2012. So after that stopped being lucrative, what did they do? They went back to email. And that's kind of the main vector again, right? Like it's really hard to block legitimate looking mails that don't necessarily directly have something malicious in them. So the example in the lower right corner there, there's no attachment, right? It's just a link that sends you to a PDF file. And of course, the PDF file has another link, and then that has something malicious in it. And it's really hard to block those things, even with a really good quality email filter, even if you've got sandboxing, right? Because the sandbox doesn't get a file, it can't analyze it. And it may go to the link to go grab a file, but that file itself is clean too. But that file links to some third file that's in fact malicious, and most sandboxes won't follow the chain that far, trying to avoid getting caught in a recursive loop where they never finish. And so there's different tricks being used. We also are seeing phone numbers as a lure. So again, how do you filter an email that doesn't have a link, doesn't have an attachment? So they're moving back to social scams, and whether those social scams are coming in via email or via WhatsApp, often that'll vary by country as well. In certain countries where, like, when I travel, there's countries where, like, if I don't have WhatsApp, I can't talk to anyone because that's the only way they communicate. Then we'll see the scams coming in through WhatsApp. And in North America, you see them on SMS, you'll see them on Facebook Messenger, and mostly email. So these guys, I had literally talked to our team when they asked me to do this presentation, and I said, oh, I'm going to have to remove the section on Revil because they vanished. Like around, I want to say the second week of July, we didn't see any activity from Revil, and their website where they try to embarrass and shame their victims also vanished from the dark web. And so I thought, oh, I'll just have to put some other, there's plenty of content. Unfortunately, there's plenty of malicious activity to share with you. But I thought, oh, I have to take the Revil section out. That's too bad. It's a really great story. And Monday morning, I got a instant message from a journalist at Fortune magazine saying, hey, did you see that Revil's website's back up? I'm like, what? And I went and looked, and sure enough, their website was back up, and didn't really mean they were active. We hadn't seen any victims. We hadn't seen any new malicious samples come into our labs. So I wasn't really sure if they were back. And then I think it was yesterday morning when I was going over these slides one last time before I shared them with Digital Edge. At the very moment I was about to send off the slides, I got a message saying, hey, there's a new victim up on the Revo website. I'm like, oh no, like they are back. So I didn't have to remove the good, save me some work. I didn't have to make some new slides, but Revel's back, and Revel claims they've named them. They don't like being called Revel. They want to be called R Evil. So we call them Revel because they don't like it. And they apparently named themselves after the Resident Evil movie. And it looks like if you follow ransomware or you read a lot of stories in the security space, you may have heard of another group called GanCrab. They were a little older. We think the GanCrab group reorganized into Revel at some point. It looks, the code base is very similar. If they didn't steal the code, they're probably the same people rebranded, if you will, as Revel. They're quite famous. One of their famous things is they auction off the stolen data from the victims, which is quite nefarious. There's no proof anybody's ever bought the data. They put the auctions up. They won't disclose whether anybody bid or not. So I think they're being cheeky. If somebody was actually bidding on it, they would brag about it. They've got a very large mouth. So it seems unlikely that anybody's bidding on it, but they do. And they post all their stuff to what they call the happy blog. And it is not a good day when your information shows up on the happy blog, because that means they've probably been in your network somewhere between 10 and 30 days. They've literally stolen every valuable thing they can find to use in an extortive technique. Unfortunately, Ensinger Plastics is the latest victim. That's the brand new one that showed up yesterday that we had not seen any victims posted since the South Carolina one there that was previous, which was back in July. But you can see some of the text that they're bragging about, how they got all the client social security number, date of birth information from court cases that the South Carolina legal organization had. In the Ensinger Plastic stuff, it's like all of their contracts and finances and bank statements and HR data for their employees. This group has been known to literally phone up employees on the telephone and say, hey, by the way, we have your social security number and your salary information and your banking information and everything because we broke into your company. You might want to tell the CEO he really ought to pay us because we're not screwing around. So they try to extort even individuals within victim organizations often. And they love bragging about their exploits, and they have been incredibly successful. I could not estimate the actual revenue, but their claims of making $100 million a reel are plausible. Like, to me, that's a plausible number. If you're interested, there's some fantastic stuff out there other researchers have done. If you go on YouTube, you can see Elite Russian Hackers Revel, how to earn 100 million US dollars on ransomware. That's on YouTube. It's an interview with the guy, the main guy, who's often referred to as Unknown. That's his actual name. And he talks about how he makes $100 million a year and why they choose to attack certain victims and not others. Another innovation last year that they had was they offered $1 million bounty, I guess, if you will, on one of the dark web forums to hire penetration testers to work for them. And if you think about, if you've ever hired penetration testers, if you haven't, you should. But if you've ever hired them, you know what their job is: to penetrate your network, right? And tell you how they got in and give you kind of a roadmap to understand how you could do a better job at keeping them out the next time. And you're winning with pen testers when you frustrate them and make them mad. And the same is true with cyber criminals. So it's a great practice exercise for learning how this is going to work, because it's exactly what the criminals are doing. They put $1 million bounty out to hire penetration testers to get them to turn to the dark side, if you will, and join the Revo affiliate group. Ransomware group to help them conduct these attacks. And the quote, there's another interview with Unknown that was in Recorded Futures blog, one of our competitors. It's a great write-up by Dimitri, and he talks with the guy, and the guy explains like how fortunate a life he's had, and when he was growing up in the Soviet Union, he would be scrounging through the trash heaps trying to look for a cigarette that cigarette butt end he could smoke, and now he's a millionaire. And that goes a long way toward recruiting people, some of that swagger. We suspect these groups, again, are specialists, right? So Revel themselves just operate sort of the way to collect the money and do the ransom attack. And then they have affiliates that join the program, and they split the proceeds, typically 70-30, between the affiliate and the parent group. so that they all get a cut of the proceeds. And so Revil sort of provides you with the malware, the tools, the instructions, and then the pen testers that join them do the actual break-in, and then they use the code that was provided by the Revil group, and Revil collects the ransom and divvies it up to everyone to the portion that they've agreed to ahead of time. And there was big news, I want to say 6 or 8 weeks ago, Kaseya, which is a remote access product used by many managed service providers. Certainly many of Sophos managed service providers that use our product use Kaseya to help manage their clients' environments. We had many victims. Fortunately, all of our different technologies were able to block most of the Kaseya attacks, not in every case, but almost all of them that were part of this attack we were able to block. But you can see this is what we call a root cause analysis. This is how we analyze what a piece of malware does. And you can see all the different components. All the ones with gears are different programs on the computer, right? And then, of course, the ones that have keys next to them are accessing or reading and writing registry keys. And all the little file folder ones are files that were either wrote or read by the software when it was running. And this is one of the ways we analyze how these things work. And I'm not going to walk you through all this because obviously it's a very complicated diagram, but it shows you how complex. And if you look at the names of some of those executables, almost all of them, I believe every single one of them, I believe in this case, is non-malicious. They're all legitimate tools that have just been combined in such a clever way as to cause harm in the end. Actually, the only one, I'll talk about a little later in the presentation. There's one file at the very end that you could detect as something that was truly malicious. The rest of it you have to do based on behavior. And this is one of the reasons that security has changed so much in the last few years. It used to be you could analyze a file, and if you decide, is the file a good file or a bad file? Is it trying to hook my keyboard and steal all my keystrokes? Or is it going to show me puppies? And, it was kind of black and white. Now we have to analyze behaviors. Analyzing files doesn't do you any good because all these files are legitimate. The Windows command prompt, Microsoft PowerShell, these are legitimate programs. Like, we can't block them. We have to look at what that program's doing and decide, is somebody manipulating this good thing into doing something bad? So this becomes very complex, and it's completely had to change the tools and the mindset for how we analyze threats and how we're going to block them to protect a victim's computer. And these are the kinds of, things that we distill things down into. If you work full-time in security, some of you may be familiar with the MITRE attack matrix, and that's just a way for us to have a language to speak to one another about what any given kind of attacker might be doing, what processes they're using. And so we map these things to try to share these as sort of a rule books for others that want to block the threat, right? You can look at this basic matrix of activities, and then you can just, check your tools to see if they're watching for these things or if you're vulnerable to them. And when you combine the information on the right, like the IP addresses and some of the behaviors and things to look for, and when you combine it with the things on the left, which are the techniques that the criminal used, you get a pretty good picture of ways to test your own defenses to see if you're vulnerable to these attacks, if the attackers would be successful, or if your products would block that network activity, that kind of thing. And anybody that's interested in this stuff, we offer 10,000 analyses like this for free a month if you go and look up our Sophos Labs Intellics on Amazon Marketplace. It's totally free for up to 10,000 lookups. So if you get a file and your security team doesn't know what to do with it, they can throw it at this and get reports that will come out that are like the ones here on the screen at no cost at all, where we'll just do a full analysis of that file and tell you everything we know about it. Now, this group is the one I worry about the most. Revil brags the most, not that they're not successful, they are, but Revil's never been as prolific as Conti. Conti seems to have a lot more affiliates, and Conti is the main one we're still seeing. Well, obviously Revil was on vacation the last 2 months, or we don't know why Revil disappeared, but they were gone. So that, of course, allowed the Conti number to continue to increase in comparison to the number of victims compared to the number of Revil victims. But this just kind of walk you through like how an attack looks, or sort of how this plays out for a real victim. This is one that we got called in with our rapid response to a customer, and unfortunately the customer didn't have our stuff enabled on all their computers. So even though we were able to defend parts of their network against the attack, other parts of the network where we weren't enabled, we obviously weren't able to help them with those computers. So they still were victimized in the end. And I don't know what they're named for. I found this beer in Brazil called Conti, and my friends in Brazil had no idea what They'd never heard of this beer, and apparently one of them went out and bought it and sent me a note from our team in Brazil and told me that it's terrible beer. And I agree, it's terrible computer code. They're terrible people, and even if they're named after the beer, apparently the beer is terrible too. But they started out with an unpatched FortiGate firewall. This is a very common technique for these guys. There's millions of unpatched VPNs and firewalls out there, unfortunately. And they're setting ducks for groups like this. And so they broke into the FortiGate firewall, similar to the VPN situation. I believe this particular firewall was using Active Directory for its authentication mechanism. And because it was compromised, it had cached credentials on it. That allowed them to get into domain admin. So it took them 16 minutes from when they exploited the firewall until they had extracted those domain administrator credentials. And in that 16 minutes, they were able to log into 2 different servers inside the network with administrative credentials. So this is why we need to think about detection and response just as much as prevention. Obviously, it would have been great to prevent this by patching the firewall, but it's impossible to close all the holes within your network. You've got human error, you've got patching windows. I mean, today, Patch Tuesday was today. I suspect many of you have not applied Windows patches today yet. It's only been out for 5 hours, right? But there's 0 days that are really easy to attack in today's patch from Microsoft. So that's 5 hours for criminals to have opportunity to get in, and there's literally nothing you could do to stop them if you haven't patched. So that means you need to detect if they manage to exploit it in that window while you're waiting to patch, right? We need the layers aren't just layers of products anymore. The layers have to be layers of strategy, right? The first layer is obviously you try to prevent, but if you can't prevent, then you need to detect. And then after you detect, you got to have a plan, and you need to know how you're going to respond. And so in this case, they got on the 2 servers. They immediately deployed Cobalt Strike beacons, which is a lateral movement and data thieving tool that's designed for the good guys, but the criminals use it almost exclusively. Every ransomware group is using Cobalt Strike. And it's designed to be very stealthy and hide from antivirus products. It's quite hard to detect in many cases. So they did that to do reconnaissance. And when I say reconnaissance, literally reconnaissance, right? They're looking around the network going, where's the valuable data? I don't really care about, I don't want to ransom the janitor's laptop. Like, I'm not going to get a lot of money from that. I need to find a way to see where the good stuff is. Where are the customer records? Where are the finance stuff? Where's the HR's data? So they start using these tools to do reconnaissance, to find all the servers, find all the databases, see what's encrypted, what's not encrypted. Where are the backups? They need to know where the backups are because they want to delete the backups if they're online. In many cases, people are doing backups to the cloud now of things like Veeam, and they just log into the Veeam console and delete all the backups because they've got your password already. That's how they got in. And it's quite scary to live through one of these things if you're one of the victims, of course. The victim in this case was able to detect them on one server right away, but they didn't realize they had gotten onto a second server. So when they found them on the one server, they shut it down, they fixed the stuff, they closed the hole in the firewall, but the bad guys already had credentials now. Now they could log in with a legitimate password. They didn't need access to the vulnerability in the firewall anymore. So they kicked them off the one server, but because the criminals were still on the other server, they just continued to operate from there. And they had about 15 minutes before we discovered they were on the second server. At this point, our rapid response team was involved helping, trying to lock them out of this. And in this case, I believe the victim had our Sophos Intercept X software on all of their endpoints, but they didn't have it on any of their servers, which a lot of organizations don't put security software on their servers thinking that the vulnerabilities are at the endpoint where the victims are, where people are browsing to malicious websites or clicking links and things. But the criminals prefer the servers because they're underprotected. And so in this case, the customer hadn't protected the servers, but we got involved. They had another 15 minutes. During that 15 minutes, they started using our clone to copy that HR, IT, finance data up to a file sharing service called Mega. I don't know if you've heard of Mega. It's very similar to like Dropbox or OneDrive, this type of thing, except Mega is run by a guy named Kim.com, a criminal who lives down in New Zealand. And Mega has a tendency to look the other way at things that may not be entirely legitimate. And our clone is just a tool to mass copy things very quickly up to services like Mega. So that's what they do. They steal all your data, they put it up on Mega so that they can get access to it, and later on put it on their blog, like the Happy blog I showed you earlier. And then they started scanning the network, literally looking for password lists. So many organizations, someone has put a list of passwords in an Excel spreadsheet or in a Word document. They know to just look for files that have the word pass in them. So they literally were just looking at every file share on the net app or whatever on the whole network, just looking for files that have the word pass in them so they could get more passwords to potentially cause more mayhem. They were able to load the ransomware onto 300 computers. And then at that point, we got control and were able to boot them out. So I put there, stop by InterceptX and rapid response, because we were able to protect the computers that had software installed on them, but we weren't able to protect the other ones. And it took both detection and response in order to kick them out, right? We had to find them, and we found them by getting alerts from the computers that were protected. And then we were able to then kick in the emergency response team to come in and boot them off the network. And that's really the strategy I think organizations need to have. You need to have a plan for what you're going to do when the bad thing happens. You need to have people that are actively watching to make sure that bad things aren't happening. And then, of course, you do your best to do prevention on the front end so that you don't need to pull that plan off the shelf. But since I know many of you are in South Florida, you probably are in situations similar to where I am here in British Columbia, which is you probably have a plan of what you're going to do to your business when a hurricane hits, because it's not like there aren't going to be hurricanes that are going to impact your institution. And it's very easy to turn those into a ransomware response plan. And I encourage you, if you haven't got a ransomware response plan or a malware response plan, that you look into that. And if you've got an existing business continuity plan for hurricanes, you can retask that, because what you're trying to do is keep your business operating when the computers are off or when people can't be at the office. And it's no different than a hurricane. And here we do the same thing for earthquakes, right? We plan and we have earthquake drills, and we've got books and what are we going to do if there's an earthquake and we can't get to the office, or how do we operate the company if Vancouver's offline, or this kind of thing. And if we have an incident, it's a great starting point for a blueprint to how to respond to a malware incident as well. Business email compromise, I mean, this is tough, right? This is social stuff. And this is why detection and response are important, because prevention's, I won't say it's impossible. We're working really hard on it, but gosh, prevention's tough. Because in most cases, they're very low volume attacks. They're sending one email to the director of finance and one email to the CEO and one email to the head of HR. They're often sent using compromised mailboxes. So often even inside mailboxes, right? They'll steal the email they'll phish the password of a low-level employee who's having a bad day, who just got the call from the school that their kid's sick and they got to come pick them up. And when they get that person's password, they just log into your Outlook web access or your O365 or Gmail or whatever you use. And now they've got an inside person sending a legitimate email to an executive going, hey, I need you to do this, or I need you to change that. And clearly the goal in the end is to get one of the executives' accounts so that they can instruct somebody to do a wire transfer or whatever kind of crime they're going to commit. But because of the low volume, and because they're often not coming from the outside, you may not even have a filter in place. Many organizations only can spam filter from outside email addresses. So if it's coming from the inside, I mean, they're inside the house. It's like those horror movies, right? And so they're really hard to deal with. And they often don't have attachments or URLs, right? They're literally instructions explaining something. There's an emergency and I need you to do something, right? And so there's very little for a sandbox to analyze or something like that in order to do anything technically about it. And so we've been working on artificial intelligence models, and I'm sure we're not the only ones, because there's some really interesting ways you can go about it. Because really what we know they're going to do is if they get into that person's mail account, they're going to ask them to do something, right? And we need to be able to teach a computer what the context of a message is and whether that makes any sense. And we can go and analyze all of the emails the CEO's ever sent and create a model around that. And then when an email is sent from that account, we can detect whether that has all the key components of something that's wrong, and whether it's written in a style that matches the way that person normally writes. Like when I get emails from our CEO at Sophos, Chris Hagerman, he signs off his emails with a lowercase KH. If I ever got an email from him that said Chris or Christopher or whatever, I'd be super suspicious. I'm like, that's not the way Chris sends emails, right? So we can use some of that with AI models to detect when somebody's trying to do something. And you can kind of see the example here on the screen. I think it's pretty clever. It's interesting. It's not perfect, but some of the data I just saw this morning, I'm probably not supposed to talk about, but I don't know. It's like, I think they were saying it was around 80% effective with a 0.1% false positive rate, which is pretty darn good. I mean, that's 1 in 1,000 that you accidentally think might be suspicious, and yet you're blocking 4 out of 5 really bad ones. So it's evolving, right? But this is the kind of thing we're having to do now. This isn't just about analyzing an IP address if it's bad. We're having to do pretty sophisticated things in order to try to stop these more advanced attackers. Another big thing right now is supply chain compromise. There's lots of different ways to compromise supply chains. If you're in the software business or you have part of your business that has a DevOps group that is required to write code or write scripts, even if it's just for IT to operate the network and things like that, we're seeing more and more open source software packages get malicious code slipped into them. Packages was one of them, but we've seen this with Python pip. We've seen it with NPM, which is the JavaScript code repository. We've seen it with pretty much every open source language where somebody malicious takes over an abandoned package that maybe thousands of organizations around the world are using and don't realize that somebody malicious is now giving them the updates to it. And so that's a thing to watch for. It's a hard thing to defend against. Within Sophos, we use, I think, 10 or 12 different programming languages in developing different products and services, and they all have potential vulnerability for this, right? So it's a bit of a task to kind of keep on top of the integrity of your software supply chain, but it's very important. And in the old days, it just used to be governments doing this kind of stuff. The US was alleged to have been behind the flame malware, which compromised Windows updates in order to target, I don't even remember who the target was. I want to say Iran. It was done very delicately and interestingly, and it was, statecraft level stuff that we never saw cyber criminals dabbling in. And then of course, SolarWinds happened. And of course, SolarWinds appears to be state level as well, but suddenly it wasn't, the Americans were careful to only infect the 10 computers that they wanted to impact in Iran and not have any innocent casualties, where in the case of SolarWinds, hundreds of organizations, if not thousands, were impacted. Including us. Like, fortunately, we didn't get the malware, but we were SolarWinds customers, and we had to go into full emergency mode trying to figure out what happened. Were we included in the attack? And fortunately for us, we were not exploited. We did not receive a malicious payload, at least. But the same can't be said for everyone. Certainly, lots of other people in our industry were impacted. And you don't exactly want to stop taking updates from your software vendors, right? Because if you don't take the updates, you get hacked. And now it turns out if you do take the updates, you might get hacked. So we really have to look at this a different way than we did. And these are very vexing challenges. And it's incredibly important if you're part of the supply chain, like we are, like people rely on our software updating every hour at every customer in the world to maintain their security. We have to do 10 times more than the average organization to ensure that we're a secure link in that chain. We have a responsibility and obligation for national security reasons. We have an obligation to do those things. And we hope that SolarWinds and others learn from these mistakes. Shouldn't laugh, but SolarWinds was a bit of a security mess, it sounds like. And when you're an important link in that chain, you have to take that responsibility seriously. And I don't have a lot more time. I've got about 10 more minutes. I'm not going to go through this in too much detail because I don't know how technical y'all are, but this is sort of a simplified version of how the Kaseya attack happened. But in essence, there was a vulnerability in Kaseya's internet-facing gateway, where if you wanted to remote access computers at a company and you're an MSP, you would log into sort of this web portal, and then you'd pick which computer, and then you'd have to authenticate and all this kind of thing. And there was a vulnerability that meant you could do an unauthenticated upload and take control of that server. And so that's how all those organizations were impacted that had Kaseya installed on their networks. And this is why it didn't affect their cloud product, right? They have a cloud product as well. And if you were in their cloud, they were able to fix this before anybody was able to exploit it. But because the people that had an on-premises version, that meant they had to patch. And if they hadn't patched it, the criminals were able to get in. And that's in fact exactly what happened. And they did some really clever stuff. They abused some of the certificate management stuff that's built into Windows. They used PowerShell, and they actually were able to hide payloads and fake security certificates, and then use Microsoft security, Microsoft's built-in utility called CertUtil to extract the malicious things from inside of the fake security certificate. Super clever stuff on behalf of these guys. And in the end, they even abused Microsoft Defender, the built-in antivirus tool in Windows. It had a vulnerability, and they were able to exploit the vulnerability in the antivirus product to then ultimately deliver the ransomware payload that you see the ransom note there in the lower right-hand corner. So this was particularly bad, but it was also just to show the sophistication and to show that all of these components until the very end were all legitimate files. And this is kind of what we're up against now. So I'm going to wrap up on the end here with initial access brokers. Largely, they're getting in all the ways they've been getting in all along. But what you have to remember is they just need a foothold, right? They don't need to get in on the most important server. They don't need to get in necessarily as the domain admin like the Conti crew did that I just noted a few moments ago. They just needed to get in somehow. And once they're in, they're going to sell you off to another criminal. And often that's still through unpatched stuff. We actually had a victim of a ransom attack last week that we were helping, who had a Adobe Cold Fusion web server that hadn't been patched in 10 years. And it wasn't that this company was negligent. Like, they normally patched all their stuff right away. They literally just forgot that it was there. They hadn't done a scan and realized this server was still online. It wasn't running their main website anymore. It was an old asset that got left online, but it didn't matter because it presented itself as a foothold for those attackers to exploit it and get into the network. So we see a lot of that. Most of this, to be fair, is just old stolen passwords that people are reusing everywhere. People do reuse their personal LinkedIn account password on the corporate network. And if you don't have multi-factor authentication enabled, especially with the remote work situation right now, you're a sitting duck, because even if you've only got 200 employees, 500 employees, like, what's the likelihood that none of those 200 have reused a password from Facebook at work, or LinkedIn, or whatever other thing where it may get stolen, or there may be other malware on their personal computer that they're logging into Facebook with that's not on their corporate computer, but the password's the same. And that's just enough for the criminals to get in and get a foothold. So multi-factor authentication is essential at preventing these things. Piracy, weirdly, this is often regional, depending on what part of the world you're in. Most of the detections we get come from Southeast Asia, where people may not be able to afford a subscription to Photoshop, and so they download a pirated version. Of course, pirated anything is just riddled with malware, because it's how the criminals now make money pirating software, by embedding malware into it so they can get paid for the malware. And so obviously malicious documents with macros and things have been big. In fact, there was a 0-day in Windows that was patched today in Microsoft Office that exploits an IE vulnerability, but all it took was opening up a Word document or a PowerPoint. So clearly attachments are still part of the game, and they're getting pretty clever with some of these things. The one on the left, the left and the top right are the most common social ones now. They're really hard to block. The one on the upper right, I actually got it in my personal mailbox at home. It pretended to be an Amazon subscription that I was going to be charged $119 a month, but there was no link and no attachment. And instead, there's a phone number. For information, call us now, and a phone number 206, which of course is a Seattle phone number. I live in Vancouver. I'm like, it's very plausible that you would get an email if you were going to call someone at Amazon, that it would be a 206 area code, maybe, right? I would have expected toll free. Amazon's loaded, but who knows, right? And if you call the number, they literally talk you through infecting your computer, like going to download the malicious thing and installing it. And they're telling you that it's the way you need to get a special form to cancel this subscription. So go to this website, download this thing. It's very plausible. They're helping you out. The only implausible thing about it is that you'd never talk to a human being at Amazon, no matter how hard you tried. In real life, if you try to get help from Amazon, good luck. But they're doing this to bypass filtering, and it's somebody nice on the telephone trying to help you do something you want to do. You're likely to do what they ask you to do. And exchange vulns, I mean, I can't say patch enough. I mean, all these groups, as soon as these things come out, originally it was proxy login in I want to say February, and we just saw group after group after group abusing proxy login to get into anybody that still had Exchange servers sitting out there. And again, we saw probably a quarter of the victims maybe that I saw they weren't even using Exchange anymore. They had migrated to Office 365, but the server was still sitting there, right? They weren't using it, but they never turned it off. And so a vulnerable entity was just sitting there facing the internet in a place where it could be compromised. And then another vulnerability was discovered in August, known as proxy shell, and that's being heavily abused right now by both cryptojackers and ransomware attack groups. We've seen Conti using it now. Conti is just a scary, scary one, because they're really good at what they do. And if you've got an Exchange server out there and it wasn't patched from August, they're in it. Like they're already on it, and they just haven't gotten around to exploiting you yet. Like they get in, and it may be a month after they get in before they actually come and trigger the ransomware, because they've got so many victims to process. They can't necessarily get to them all fast enough. And next, I predict a thing you need to keep on the horizon is cookie theft. We're starting to see more and more malware stealing cookies. And the reason for that is it often bypasses multi-factor authentication. So if you use Slack to communicate in your organization, and you've got multi-factor turned on in Slack, well, if I steal your Slack authentication cookie, from your computer, I don't have to use the multi-factor. I just put that cookie on my computer and I'm logged in as you now. And so we are seeing an increase in focus on targeting cookies, and we're all working on defenses for this, but right now it's pretty hard to defend against. Obviously, turn multi-factor on, set cookie expirations to be short, so that if a criminal steals them, they're unlikely to be able to use them. So for example, one of my logins that I use frequently for work, I believe the cookie is only there for 4 days. So the criminal steals it, they've got to use it within the 4 days, and they're probably not going to be able to sell it on to another criminal that quickly. Sort of like a credit card expiration, right? Those expiration dates are annoying to criminals, right? Because you steal credit cards, you got to sell them all right away, because every month another quarter of them is going to, or 10% of them are going to, time out from the expiration dates and not be useful to sell as a criminal anymore. So I'm going to end there and thank you guys for inviting me. I hope you found this informative and interesting. There's so much stuff to cover and so much going on out there. It's very difficult to get through it all, but I certainly find this incredibly interesting, and hopefully you got some ideas of things you might be able to improve in your security posture to be safer going forward.
Thank you, Chester. That was a very informative presentation. I'm actually impressed by the amount of ground that you were able to cover in just an hour. That was really wall to wall with great information to take away about the latest trends and threats. I want to remind everybody that we will be continuing this 3-day session tomorrow, which is Wednesday, and of course Thursday as well. And each day it will be from 4 to 6. We're very grateful to Chester, and we're very grateful to the entire Digital Edge team for providing this great content for us today. And then anybody, if you have questions, you can certainly reach out to Digital Edge. Specifically, you can reach out to Chester as well, and we'll be happy to make sure that you connect on with them on any additional matters. So I do see one question actually popping up, and I know we got just a minute left, so maybe Chester, I'll throw it at you real fast and we'll see if we can get a response. Can you please explain about how we can shorten the time of cookies? What about setting cookies to be deleted when log off? Does that help too?
Absolutely. The two easiest ways, especially for an enterprise, to approach this is, yes, if you delete cookies, obviously it's annoying because you got to log in every time. So you can take one or both approaches, right? Personally, so if you're using a service like Okta or one of these authentication management tools that help you, or Duo or these types of things, they allow you to set the cookie length time. So often you'll see that check mark when you're logging into O365, and it might say, remember me for 4 days, or remember me for 20 days, or remember me forever. Many cookies last forever if you don't expire them. And so at least for your enterprise tools, you should be able to control that through whatever authentication management tools you're using. They all have settings to say, allow people to store their authentication for X hours, X days, X months, etc. Outside tools can be tougher, right? Like things like Slack, other than deleting your cookies out of your browser, there's not much you can do, because Slack doesn't provide you a choice to say, only remember my login for X hours. As far as I know, I'm not a Slack administrator, but I did look at this and I couldn't figure out a way to do it. So hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Chester. That's very helpful. And with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up. Everybody, we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. And if you are going to be looking for CPE certificates, of course, those will come within approximately a week, is typically about the amount of time that it takes to turn those around. So have a great evening. Thank you to Chester. Thank you to the entire Digital Edge team. And we look forward to seeing you at the same time and place tomorrow.
Thank you, and see you. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.